Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I never thought my life could fall apart in so many ways at once. But here I am, divorced, betrayed by my own brother, and now my parents are calling me selfish for refusing to pay for my ex-wife's kids' college. When I found out my wife was cheating on me, it was like getting hit by a truck. But what made it unbearable, what ripped my soul into pieces, was learning it wasn't some random guy. It was my brother. My own flesh and blood. The two people I trusted most in the world had been sneaking around behind my back for almost a year. It all started on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday. I got off work early because a client canceled a meeting. My initial plan was to grab takeout and surprise my wife and kids. As I walked through the front door, something felt wrong. The house was too quiet. Normally, at that time of day, I'd hear my kids bickering about homework or my wife in the kitchen. Instead, there was this heavy silence, like the house was holding its breath. I wasn't looking for trouble, but when I turned to hang up my jacket, I froze. My brother's leather jacket was draped over the back of the chair by the door. It was unmistakable, black with a worn patch on the left sleeve. He'd been wearing it since high school. "Hey, babes," I called out, my voice already tinged with suspicion. I heard quick footsteps upstairs. My wife appeared at the top of the staircase, her face pale as a ghost. "You're home early," she said, her voice a little too bright, a little too forced. I gestured toward the jacket. "Is Matt here?" She hesitated for half a second, just long enough to confirm what my gut was already screaming. "Oh, he stopped by earlier," she said quickly. "He's not here now?" Before I could respond, I heard the faint creak of floorboards from the guest room. My guest room, the one no one was supposed to be using. I didn't say anything. I just walked upstairs. Wait, my wife stammered, rushing to block my path. But it was too late. I threw the guest room door open, and there he was, my brother, shirtless, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands like a kid caught stealing cookies. For a moment, everything went quiet. My mind couldn't catch up with what my eyes were seeing. It was like my brain refused to process it. Then the rage hit me, a tidal wave of fury that made my vision blur. "What the hell is this?" I shouted, my voice shaking with betrayal. Matt looked up at me, his face red and his mouth moving like he was searching for words. My wife was crying now, blubbering something about how it wasn't what it looked like, but the evidence was all around me. The rumpled sheets, the guilty faces. It was exactly what it looked like. I couldn't deal with it. I turned on my heel, stormed downstairs, and grabbed my keys. "You can have each other," I said as I walked out the door. "You deserve each other." I drove aimlessly for hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Every time I tried to calm down, the image of them together in that room flashed in my mind, and the rage would bubble up all over again. It wasn't just the cheating that gutted me. It was who she cheated with. My brother wasn't just some guy. He was someone I had grown up with, someone I had shared everything with. We were supposed to have each other's backs. And now he had stolen my wife. That night, I slept in my car. I couldn't bring myself to go home, not to the house where they had betrayed me. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I didn't even bother confronting them again. What was the point? There was no apology that could fix this, no explanation that could make it hurt less. My wife tried to call me a dozen times over the next few days, leaving voicemail after voicemail, begging me to come back and talk. But what was there to say? She made her choice, and so did my brother. As far as I was concerned, they were both dead to me. The fallout hit me hard. I moved into a tiny apartment across town, taking only the bare essentials. Everything else, furniture, photos, mementos, I left behind. I didn't want anything that reminded me of them or the life I thought I had. For weeks, I felt like a ghost. I went to work, came home, and stared at the walls, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I thought about my kids constantly. How was I going to explain this to them? Would they even understand? One night, after one too many drinks, I sent my brother a text. It wasn't long, just 2 words, "We're done." He didn't reply, and I didn't need him to. The message was clear. From that moment on, I decided to cut them both out of my life completely. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't trust anyone again. Not after this. If I thought the betrayal was bad, the divorce was a full-blown nightmare. I had no idea how far my wife, ex-wife, as I now had to think of her, was willing to go to tear my life apart. She filed first, claiming I was emotionally unavailable and prioritized work over family. That last part hit me hard because, in a way, it was true. I had been working long hours, but not because I didn't care about my family. I was doing it for them. For her, for the kids. My lawyer tried to warn me that custody battles rarely favored fathers, but I didn't want to believe it. I went into court thinking that being a decent dad who had never laid a hand on his kids, never missed a payment, and never failed to put food on the table would count for something. I thought the truth mattered. Turns out it didn't. The courtroom was a cold, clinical place. My ex-wife sat across from me with her lawyer, looking polished and composed. She even brought my brother as a character witness, my brother. I couldn't believe the audacity of it. He sat there in his cheap suit, pretending to be the voice of reason, while I felt like screaming across the table. Her lawyer painted me as an absent father, someone who worked too much and missed out on important milestones. While Mr. Davis was focused on his career, the lawyer said, Mrs. Davis was the one nurturing and raising the children. She didn't even have to try hard to sell it. The court loves the narrative of the struggling, dedicated mom versus the distant dad. When the judge ruled in her favor, it felt like someone had reached inside my chest and yanked out my heart. Full custody. She got full custody. I was reduced to a visitor in my own children's lives. Every other weekend, a few holidays, and maybe a summer trip if she felt generous. And the house? Gone. The kids' bedrooms, the backyard where we used to play catch, the kitchen where we made pancakes on Sunday mornings. It was all hers now. The kicker? My brother moved in the day after the ink dried on the divorce papers. Seeing him in my old house, living my old life, was unbearable. The first time I picked up the kids for a weekend visit, he was the one who answered the door. I'll never forget the smug look on his face. It took everything I had not to punch him right then and there. Hey, he said casually, like we were still brothers, like he hadn't torn my life apart. The kids are just grabbing their stuff. Come on in if you want. I stayed on the porch, clenching my fists so hard that my nails dug into my palms. Don't pretend we're good, I said through gritted teeth. He shrugged, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the place. I'm just trying to make things easier for everyone. No hard feelings, right? Before I could say something I'd regret, my kids came running out. They barely glanced at me as they passed, too busy chatting about the fun weekend their mom had planned. I loaded them into my car, forcing a smile, but inside I was crumbling. The kids were different around me after the divorce. Quieter, distant. At first, I thought it was just the adjustment to the new schedule, but it quickly became clear that my ex-wife was planting seeds in their heads. Mom says you didn't want to be home, my youngest Lily said one day as we were driving back to my apartment. My heart sank. That's not true, sweetheart, I said carefully. I worked a lot because I wanted to give you and your brother everything you needed. Lily just nodded, staring out the window, and I knew she didn't believe me. My son, Jacob, was even harder to reach. At 12, he was old enough to understand what was happening, but not mature enough to process it. He acted out during our weekends together, refusing to listen or participate in anything I planned. One time, after I tried to take them bowling, he snapped, "Why don't you just take us back to Mom's? She actually spends time with us." That one stung. I wanted to argue, to explain that I'd been forced out of their lives. But what good would it do? They were kids. They didn't see the full picture, and they shouldn't have to. The worst moment came a few months after the divorce. I was dropping the kids off, and as I watched them walk into the house, I saw my brother step onto the porch to greet them. He ruffled Jacob's hair, making him laugh, and crouched down to tie Lily's shoe. My stomach churned as I watched the way they looked at him, like he was the fun, dependable father figure I'd been replaced with. It wasn't just that he had taken my wife. He had taken my role. He was playing house in my old home with my kids while I stood on the sidelines. I drove away that day feeling like a ghost, like I didn't exist in their world anymore. Every time I tried to rebuild some semblance of a relationship with them, my ex-wife and brother seemed to undo it. It was like they had decided I was the villain in their story, and they were rewriting history to make it stick. By the end of that first year, I was barely hanging on. I had poured every ounce of energy into trying to be the best dad I could in the limited time I had, but it felt like I was fighting a losing battle. The weekends I used to look forward to became a source of dread, a constant reminder of what I had lost. The worst part? No matter how much it hurt, I couldn't give up. I loved my kids too much to walk away, even if it felt like they didn't love me back. When everything fell apart, I thought the one constant I could rely on was my parents. I mean, what parent wouldn't be furious if one son betrayed the other in the worst way possible? I was sure they'd take my side. They'd see how much I was hurting, how deeply I'd been betrayed. But instead of the righteous anger I expected, all I got was awkward silence and half-hearted platitudes. Family is family, my mom said the first time I brought it up. You have to find a way to forgive. I stared at her, dumbfounded. Forgive? Mom, he slept with my wife. They ruined my marriage, stole my kids, and now he's living in my house. How am I supposed to forgive that? Her response was a dismissive wave of her hand, like I was overreacting. It's not good to hold on to grudges, honey. You'll only make yourself miserable. At first, I thought they were just trying to keep the peace. My dad, in particular, seemed to go out of his way to avoid the subject. Whenever I'd vent about what my brother and ex-wife had done, he'd shrug and mutter something like, "These things happen." No sense dwelling on it. "These things happen?" I repeated once, my voice rising with disbelief. "You make it sound like it's some kind of accident, like he tripped and fell into my wife's bed." My dad had the nerve to chuckle. "Come on, don't be so dramatic. You're better off moving on." That was the moment I realized they weren't just trying to be neutral. They were brushing the whole thing under the rug. It was easier for them to pretend everything was fine than to confront the ugly truth. Then came the real slap in the face. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, my mom casually mentioned that she was hosting a Sunday dinner. "You should come," she said brightly, like nothing had changed. I hesitated. "Who else is coming?" Her expression shifted slightly, and she glanced away. "Well, your brother and Jessica will be there. They're family too." The air left my lungs. "Are you serious?" I asked. "You're inviting them? After everything they've done?" She sighed, like she was the one being inconvenienced. "They've apologized, sweetheart. They made a mistake, but they're trying to move forward. We all should." I felt my blood boil. "They didn't make a mistake, Mom. They made choices. And now you're rewarding them by acting like nothing happened? Don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said, her tone sharp now. "You need to let it go and be the bigger person." I didn't go to that dinner or any other family gatherings after that. I couldn't stomach the thought of sitting across the table from them, pretending everything was fine. I tried to explain to my parents how much it hurt, how their actions felt like another betrayal on top of the first. But they didn't get it, or maybe they just didn't care. "It's not about taking sides," my mom insisted during one of our last conversations. "We love both of our sons. We just want everyone to get along." "Yeah? Well, one of your sons destroyed the other's life," I snapped. "But I guess that doesn't matter as long as the holidays aren't awkward for you." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't like your tone, young man." I laughed bitterly. "You don't like my tone? Imagine how I feel about my life." Cutting them off wasn't easy. As much as I hated what they were doing, they were still my parents. A part of me kept hoping they'd come around, that they'd realize how wrong it was to play happy families with my brother and ex-wife. But instead, they doubled down. They started posting pictures on social media, big smiling group shots with my kids, my brother, and Jessica all gathered around the dinner table. My mom even tagged me in one, as if to rub it in my face. The comments were full of people gushing about how lucky our family was to be so close. Every time I saw one of those photos, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. The final straw came when my dad called me out of the blue, asking why I hadn't been to any family events. "Because I don't feel welcome," I said bluntly. "That's ridiculous," he said. "You're always welcome." "Am I?" I shot back. "Because it sure feels like you've picked a side, and it's not mine." "You're being dramatic," he said, the same dismissive tone he always used. "We're just trying to keep the family together." "Well, congratulations," I said. "You've done a great job keeping them together. I hope it's worth losing me in the process." I hung up and blocked their numbers that night. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the only way to protect myself from the constant reminders of their betrayal. I'd lost my wife, my home, and my kids. I wasn't going to keep losing pieces of myself, trying to please people who clearly didn't care about my pain. I've been on my own ever since. Some days I wonder if I made the right choice. But when I think about the alternative, sitting across from my brother and ex-wife, pretending everything is fine, I know I couldn't have done it any other way. Fast forward nearly a decade, and the scars from my divorce and my family's betrayal were finally starting to feel less raw. My kids were teenagers now, getting ready for college. While I didn't see them as often as I wanted, I still did everything I could for them. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time I got my paycheck, I put a little aside for their futures. I knew I couldn't control how things had turned out, but at least I could make sure they had options when it came to college. I'd gotten used to the distance. My relationship with Jacob and Lily wasn't what I'd hoped it would be, but it wasn't entirely gone either. They were polite when we talked, a little standoffish, but I chalked that up to being teenagers. Maybe when they got older, they'd understand my side of things. I wasn't perfect, but I'd always done my best for them. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed one Sunday afternoon. It was my mom. "Hey," she said in her usual cheerful tone, like nothing had happened, like we hadn't been estranged for years. "Mom?" I asked, surprised. "Is everything okay?" She let out a long, exaggerated sigh. Not really, sweetheart. It's about the kids. Have you thought about how you're going to pay for their college? I sat there, stunned. What do you mean? I've been saving for years. I have accounts set up for both of them. Oh, that's good, she said quickly, a little too quickly. But the thing is, it's not enough. Jessica and Matt are struggling right now, and they're worried they won't be able to cover the tuition. My jaw tightened at the mention of their names. Even after all these years, hearing them still felt like salt in an open wound. They're struggling? I asked, my voice flat. And this is my problem because, well, they're the ones raising the kids, she said, her tone implying that this was a perfectly reasonable explanation. It's your responsibility to step up and help. You're their father. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. My responsibility? Are you serious, Mom? I've been paying child support for years. I've been saving for their futures. Meanwhile, Jessica and Matt have been playing house with my kids. And now, when they can't manage, you expect me to bail them out? Her tone turned defensive. Don't be like that. This isn't about Matt or Jessica. It's about the kids. They shouldn't have to suffer because of adult problems. Oh, I agree, I said, barely able to keep my anger in check. That's why I've been saving for them. But if Matt and Jessica can't afford to help, maybe they shouldn't have taken over my role in the first place. My mom wasn't ready to let it go. Over the next week, she called me multiple times, trying different tactics to wear me down. One day, she guilt-tripped me, saying I was punishing my kids to get back at my brother. The next, she tried to play the family loyalty card again. Think about how it looks, she said during one call. Do you want Jacob and Lily to think you don't care about their future? They're welcome to use the money I've saved, I said, keeping my tone steady. But I'm not paying for Matt and Jessica's mistakes. Well, it's not just your decision, she snapped. This is about the kids, not your pride. You don't want them to resent you, do you? That hit a nerve. My relationship with Jacob and Lily was already fragile, and she knew it. For a moment, I almost caved, but then I remembered everything I'd been through. The betrayal, the lies, the years of being treated like an outsider in my own family. No, Mom, I said firmly. I'm not doing it. They can figure it out without me. The next call came from my dad, which was even more surprising. He rarely got involved in anything emotional, preferring to stay neutral and detached. Your mother says you're being difficult, he started, his tone gruff. Difficult? I repeated, incredulous. You mean I'm not letting myself get walked over again? He sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. This isn't about you, son. It's about making sure your kids have the best opportunities. And I've done my part, I shot back. I've saved for them, I've paid child support, and I've stayed in their lives despite everything. I'm not going to bankrupt myself to cover for Matt and Jessica's financial problems. My dad didn't argue much after that. He probably knew it was a losing battle, but the damage was already done. The real fallout came when word got back to Jacob and Lily. I don't know what my parents told them, or what Jessica and Matt had said, but suddenly my kids were angry with me. You're not going to help with college? Jacob asked during one of our rare phone calls. I am helping, I said, trying to stay calm. I've been saving for years, but I'm not responsible for what your mom and Matt can't afford. Well, they think you're being selfish, he snapped. And honestly, I do too. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Jacob, it's not that simple, I said quietly. There's a lot you don't know about what happened between us. Yes, sure, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You always have an excuse. The line went dead before I could explain further. That night, I sat in my empty apartment, staring at the savings accounts I'd set up for the kids. The money was there, ready and waiting for them, but now I wasn't even sure they'd accept it. My mom called one last time, leaving a voicemail I'll never forget. You're making a big mistake, she said, her voice icy. You're going to regret this when the kids stop speaking to you entirely. Is that what you want? To be alone? I deleted the message without responding. For years, I'd been bending over backward to keep some kind of relationship with my kids, to prove I cared even when I wasn't allowed to show it fully. And now, because I wouldn't bend further, I was the villain again. But this time, I wasn't going to let them guilt me into submission. I'd done enough. I thought the calls from my parents were bad enough. But the real storm hit when my brother and ex-wife decided to get involved. Suddenly, my phone became a battlefield. The text came first, short, passive-aggressive messages from my brother that escalated into outright insults. You're seriously not going to help your own kids, one text read. I always knew you were selfish, came another. Guess that's why Jess left you in the first place. That one sent a wave of rage through me so intense I almost threw my phone across the room. Instead, I gritted my teeth and ignored him. Engaging with Matt would only escalate things, and I didn't have the energy for his self-righteous nonsense. But it didn't stop there. Jessica started calling me, leaving voicemails dripping with indignation. "Do you even care about your kids?" she demanded in one. "Do you know what it's like for them to worry about their future because their father refuses to step up?" It was like being dragged back to the divorce all over again. Every message, every call felt like another punch to the gut, reopening wounds I thought I'd started to heal. One night, after the 10th text from Matt in a single day, I finally snapped. "Stop blaming me for your failures," I wrote back. "You're their stepdad now, aren't you? Why don't you step up for once?" The reply came almost instantly. "You're unbelievable. You've always been a deadbeat, and now you're proving it." Deadbeat. That word burned. I've been paying child support for years, even when it left me barely scraping by. I'd sacrifice vacations, nights out, and even basic comforts to make sure my kids had what they needed. But none of that seemed to matter now. The worst part was how the kids themselves started to turn on me. Jacob, my oldest, was the first to confront me directly. "You're just being stubborn," he said one day during a rare phone call. His voice was sharp, full of teenage frustration. "Mom and Matt are doing everything they can, but it's not enough. You could help, but you're choosing not to." "Jacob," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I've been saving for your college since you were a little kid. The money's there for you. I just don't think it's fair for me to cover what your mom and Matt can't handle. They've had years to prepare too." He scoffed. "So it's about punishing them? Great. Real mature, Dad." "It's not about punishment," I insisted. "It's about responsibility. I've done my part. This isn't all on me." But he didn't want to hear it. "Whatever," he said before hanging up. The next day, Lily sent me a message that broke my heart. "Why don't you care about us?" it read. I stared at those words for a long time, my chest tightening. Of course I cared. I love my kids more than anything in the world. But how could I make them understand that this wasn't about them? That this was about years of betrayal and the fact that their mom and uncle had put me in an impossible position? I tried to explain it the best I could, typing and retyping my response until it felt right. "Lily, I love you and Jacob more than anything. I've been saving for your futures for a long time, and that money is yours when you need it. But your mom and Matt have made choices that aren't my responsibility to fix. I'll always be here for you, but I can't take on everything by myself." Her reply came hours later. "Whatever, Dad." As if that wasn't enough, my mom decided to chime in again. "They're your kids," she said during yet another phone call. "It doesn't matter what happened with Jessica or Matt. You have a duty to them." "I've done my duty, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've paid child support. I've saved for college. What more do you want from me?" "You're better off financially than they are," she said, as if that was all the justification she needed. "They're struggling. You're not. It's that simple." "No, it's not," I shot back. "It's not simple at all. Where was this concern for fairness when Matt and Jessica were tearing my life apart? Did anyone think about what I was going through?" She sighed, clearly frustrated. "That's in the past. Holding on to bitterness isn't helping anyone." Bitterness. That word made me laugh. An ugly, humorless sound. "I'm not bitter," I said. "I'm just tired of being treated like I owe everyone something. I've done enough, Mom. More than enough." By the end of the week, I felt like I was drowning. No matter how much I tried to explain my side, it felt like no one was listening. My brother and Jessica were painting me as the villain. My kids were growing colder by the day, and my parents were more concerned with keeping the peace than supporting me. One night, after another barrage of texts and voicemails, I poured myself a drink and stared at the family photo I kept on my desk, the one from before everything fell apart. Jacob was grinning with his arm around Lily. Jessica and I were standing behind them, smiling like we had the perfect life. Looking at that photo, I felt a pang of grief for the family I'd lost. But I also felt something else, anger. Not just at Jessica or Matt, but at myself for letting them make me feel this way. I had given everything I could. I had done my part, and if they couldn't see that, then maybe it was time to stop trying to prove it. For weeks, I felt like I was fighting a losing battle. My parents were relentless in their calls. My ex-wife kept throwing guilt-laden messages my way, and my kids were slipping further and further away from me. I started to think I was truly alone in this mess. Everyone seemed to have bought into the narrative that I was the bad guy, the selfish one, the dad who didn't care. Then, out of the blue, I got a message from my aunt, my dad's younger sister, Clara. We weren't especially close. She lived a few states away and only showed up for major family events. Still, I always liked her. She was sharp, no nonsense, and never afraid to call things out for what they were. Her message was simple. "Hey, can we talk? I've been hearing some things, and I want to know your side." That night, I called her. half expecting it to be another attempt at guilting me. But as soon as she picked up, I could tell this wasn't going to be like the conversations I'd been having with my parents. First of all, she said, skipping the pleasantries, I'm so sorry for everything you're going through. I've been hearing bits and pieces from your mom, and frankly, I'm shocked. Her tone was full of genuine concern, and it hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized just how badly I needed someone to believe me, to actually listen without judgment. Thanks, Aunt Clara, I said, my voice cracking slightly. It's been a lot. She didn't rush me. She let me unload everything. The betrayal, the divorce, the custody battle, the constant guilt tripping over college. By the time I finished, my throat was dry, and I felt emotionally drained. Wow, she said after a long pause. I knew things were bad, but I didn't realize it was this bad. And your parents are siding with Matt and Jessica through all of this. They've been siding with them since day one, I said bitterly. It's like they're pretending the affair never happened. They just want everything to look normal, even if it means throwing me under the bus. Clara let out a sharp laugh. That sounds like your mom. Always more worried about appearances than reality. As the conversation went on, Clara's tone shifted from sympathetic to downright furious. This is absurd, she said. They've been enabling Matt and Jessica's behavior for years. And now they expect you to clean up their mess? No, absolutely not. Her words felt like a lifeline. For so long, I've been questioning myself, wondering if I was being unreasonable, if I really was the selfish person everyone was making me out to be. Hearing Clara validate my feelings was like a weight lifting off my chest. You're not crazy for saying no, she continued. You've done more than enough. It's not your fault they're financially irresponsible. If Matt wants to play house with your ex-wife, he can figure out how to pay for it. I couldn't help but laugh at that. You're the first person who said that out loud. Well, it's the truth, she said firmly. And honestly, you're handling this better than I would. If my brother pulled something like that, I'd have burned every bridge in sight. But Clara didn't just stop at words of encouragement. She asked if I consulted a lawyer recently, particularly about the college funds. I know you've been saving for the kids, she said. But depending on how those accounts are set up, Jessica might try to take control of them. You need to protect yourself. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. I'd set up the accounts in the kids' names, thinking that would keep things simple, but I realized Clara was right. If Jessica got her hands on that money, there was no telling how it would be spent. Do you know any good lawyers? I asked. As a matter of fact, I do, she said. A close friend of mine specializes in family law. I'll send you her info. She's tough as nails, and she won't let anyone push you around. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Clara wasn't just offering sympathy. She was giving me tools to fight back. Over the next few weeks, Clara became my sounding board. Whenever I felt overwhelmed or doubted myself, I'd call her, and she'd talk me down with a mix of tough love and dry humor. Let me get this straight, she said during one call. Your brother steals your wife. Your parents play mediator instead of holding him accountable. And now they're all mad at you because you won't pay for college? Do they hear themselves? They think I'm being petty, I admitted. No, she said firmly. You're setting boundaries. There's a difference. Her words gave me the strength I needed to push back harder. When my mom called again, saying, you're going to regret this when the kids resent you, I didn't let it get under my skin. If they resent me for not bailing out Matt and Jessica, that's on them, I said calmly. I've done my part, and I'm not going to let anyone guilt me into doing more. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself further. I hung up without letting her drag me into another argument. Clara's support also made me realize something important. I wasn't alone. My parents might have chosen Matt and Jessica, but that didn't mean everyone else had. Clara saw the situation for what it was, and she wasn't afraid to call out the people who were enabling bad behavior. It's not just about the money, she said during one of our talks. It's about respect. They're taking advantage of you because they think they can. The moment you stop letting them, they'll have to deal with the consequences of their actions. She was right. For years, I'd been bending over backward to keep the peace, to avoid rocking the boat. But all that had done was give my brother and ex-wife permission to keep taking from me. With Clara in my corner, I finally felt like I had the strength to stand my ground. I wasn't going to let guilt or manipulation dictate my choices anymore. If Matt and Jessica wanted to play happy family, they could figure out how to pay for it themselves. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. Tax season was always a chore, but this year, I decided to tackle it head-on rather than letting it linger. I was sifting through years of old paperwork, bank statements, receipts, financial records, all while nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. I was barely halfway through the stack when I stumbled across something that stopped me cold. It was an old bank statement from the year my life fell apart, the year of the divorce. At first, I almost tossed it aside, figuring I didn't need it anymore. But something about it caught my eye, a large transfer I didn't recognize. The transaction was labeled with a generic account transfer, but the amount, several $1,000s, was enough to make me pause. My brow furrowed as I read it again. The date on the transfer was a week before Jessica filed for divorce. I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. It couldn't be, could it? I grabbed my laptop and logged into my old online banking account, the one I hadn't touched since the divorce. After resetting the password and navigating through layers of security questions, I finally pulled up the transaction history for that year. The transfer wasn't a mistake. It was real, and it wasn't just a one-off. Over the course of 6 months leading up to the divorce, I found several similar transactions, all adding up to an amount that made my stomach churn. The account the money had been transferred to? It was my brother's. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the screen, my hands shaking. It was bad enough that Matt had betrayed me by sleeping with my wife. But now I realized they'd also been stealing from me. My money I'd been working overtime to earn, had been funding their little secret romance. Memories started to resurface. Jessica asking me to handle all the bills while she focused on managing the household. Matt mysteriously showing up with new gadgets and taking impromptu trips. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. I was too busy working to connect the dots. I felt sick. All the progress I thought I'd made, the emotional healing, the boundaries I'd set, it all felt undone in an instant. The betrayal was fresh again, raw and searing, as if it had just happened yesterday. I knew I had to confront them, but I didn't want to rush into it. This wasn't just a personal grievance. It was theft. I needed to be smart, to gather evidence in case things escalated. I spent the next few days digging through every financial record I could find. I pulled bank statements, emails, credit card bills, anything that might connect the dots further. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Not only had they been siphoning money out of our joint account, but they'd also been using my credit card to make purchases I never approved. Weekend getaways, fancy dinners, even a piece of jewelry I remembered Jessica wearing after we separated, all charged to me. How had I missed this? How had I let them take so much without realizing it? Once I had everything compiled, I called Clara. "You're not going to believe this," I said, launching into the story. By the time I finished, she was as furious as I was. "This is unbelievable," she said. "They're not just liars, they're criminals. I don't even know what to do," I admitted. Part of me wants to march over there and throw it all in their faces, but I know that's not going to fix anything. "You're right," Clara said. "Confronting them in the heat of the moment will only give them the chance to play the victim. You need to be strategic." She suggested reaching out to her lawyer friend again, not just to explore my options legally, but to get advice on how to approach the situation without letting my emotions take over. I decided to follow Clara's advice, and a week later, I had a meeting with her lawyer friend, Denise. She was every bit as sharp and tough as Clara had described. After reviewing the evidence, she confirmed that what Matt and Jessica had done wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. "You have a case for financial fraud," Denise said, "especially if the transfers were made without your consent. The only issue is that proving intent can be tricky, especially since you were married at the time. So what do I do?" I asked. Denise leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You have a few options. You could file a civil suit to recover the money, but that might drag out for years and get messy with your kids involved. Or you could confront them with the evidence and use it as leverage. Let them know you know and see how they respond." The thought of confronting them made my blood boil, but it also felt like the closure I needed. They had gotten away with so much already. It was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. My mom called, inviting me to a family dinner she was hosting. I almost declined out of habit, but then I realized it was the perfect chance to confront Matt and Jessica with an audience that needed to see the truth. The dinner itself was as awkward as I expected. Matt and Jessica acted like they belonged there, chatting with my parents like one big happy family. My kids were there too, sitting at the table with their mom and uncle as if nothing was wrong. I waited until after dessert, when everyone was still gathered around the table. Then, without a word, I pulled out the folder of evidence I'd compiled and set it down in front of Matt. "What's this?" he asked, his smug grin faltering. "Take a look," I said, my voice calm but firm. As he flipped through the pages, his face turned pale. Jessica leaned over to see, and her reaction was even more telling. Her eyes widened, and she started stammering excuses before I'd even said a word. Don't bother, I said, cutting her off. I know everything. The transfers, the charges, all of it. You weren't just sneaking around behind my back. You were stealing from me? My parents sat in stunned silence as I laid it all out. The money, the transactions, the lies. Matt tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. You've got some nerve showing your face here, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You took everything from me, my wife, my kids, my home, and now I find out you were stealing my money to do it? You're lucky I don't press charges. The confrontation left the room in chaos. My parents were flustered, my kids looked confused, and Matt and Jessica had nothing to say. For the first time in years, I felt like I had taken some of the power back. As I walked out of that house, leaving them to deal with the fallout, I realized something important. I wasn't the villain in this story. They were, and it was time they started living with the consequences of their choices. The drive to my parents' house felt like stepping into a pressure cooker. My palms were slick on the steering wheel, and my chest felt tight, but my resolve was stronger than it had ever been. For years, I kept quiet. I'd let them paint me as the bad guy, the bitter ex-husband, the difficult son. But now, with the evidence in hand, I was done being their scapegoat. It was one of my parents' infamous Sunday dinners, the kind I hadn't attended in years. The same dinners where Matt and Jessica paraded around like the perfect couple, pretending their relationship hadn't been built on betrayal. The same dinners where my parents smiled and played the part of doting grandparents while ignoring the wreckage they'd allowed to happen. When I parked outside, I could already hear laughter and clinking dishes through the open window. My stomach churned, but I reminded myself why I was here. I grabbed the folder of bank statements from the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and walked to the front door. The chatter stopped the moment I stepped inside. Look who decided to show up, Matt said with that infuriating smug grin of his. He was standing by the kitchen island, a drink in hand, looking as if he owned the place. Jessica froze in mid-conversation with my mom. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease that she quickly masked with a too bright, "Hey, this is a surprise." "Yeah, it is," I said, my voice clipped. "We need to talk." My parents exchanged confused glances, but didn't protest as I walked into the dining room and placed the folder on the table. My kids were sitting there too, chatting with my dad. They looked up at me with curious expressions. "What's this about?" my mom asked, her tone cautious. I gestured toward the folder. "Go ahead, Matt. Take a look." He hesitated, his smirk fading as he reached for the folder. Jessica leaned over his shoulder, and the color drained from her face as she saw what was inside. "What is this?" Matt asked, his voice wavering. "It's proof," I said, keeping my tone steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Proof that while you two were sneaking around behind my back, you were also stealing from me." The room was dead silent as I laid out the details. I explained how I'd discovered the bank transfers, the unauthorized charges on my credit card, and the luxury purchases they'd made with my money. My voice was calm, almost detached, but inside, I was seething. Matt tried to stammer out a response, but I didn't give him the chance. "You're pathetic," I said, glaring at him. "You couldn't even afford to fund your own affair, so you used my hard-earned money to do it. And you have the audacity to sit here, in this house, pretending to be some kind of family man." Jessica stepped in, her voice shaky but defensive. "It's not what you think." "Oh, don't even start," I snapped, cutting her off. "I've got the receipts, Jessica. Literally. So spare me whatever excuse you were about to make." My parents looked completely blindsided. My mom opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. My dad just sat there, his expression grim and unreadable. "You wanted to know why I wasn't paying for college?" I said, turning to face them. "This is why. Because I've already paid more than my fair share. And because these 2-inch," I gestured toward Matt and Jessica, "have taken enough from me as it is." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, Matt tried to regain some control of the situation. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said, his voice tight. "It's not like we drained your account or anything." I let out a bitter laugh. "Do you even hear yourself? You stole thousands of dollars from me, Matt. Thousands. That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft." Jessica tried again, her tone more pleading this time. "We didn't mean to hurt you." "Oh, spare me," I snapped. "You didn't mean to get caught. That's all this is about." My mom finally found her voice, though it was shaky and uncertain. This can't be right. Are you sure there's no mistake?" I turned to her, my expression hard. "You think I'd come here and do this if I wasn't sure? I've got the bank statements, the receipts, everything. There's no mistake, Mom. The only mistake I made was trusting them." My dad cleared his throat, his face pale. Matt, is this true? Matt hesitated, but the look on his face said it all. It was a long time ago, he muttered. We didn't think. You didn't think? I interrupted. That's your excuse? You didn't think? The room erupted into chaos. My mom started crying. My dad was yelling at Matt, and Jessica was trying to explain herself to no one in particular. My kids just sat there, wide-eyed and silent, clearly unsure of what to make of the situation. I waited until the noise died down, then spoke one last time. You all wanted to make me the villain, I said, my voice steady. You wanted to guilt me into cleaning up after them, to keep playing the role of the bad guy while they got away with everything. Well, not anymore. I'm done. You can deal with this mess on your own. I turned and walked out without looking back. As I got into my car and drove away, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I'd stood up for myself, really stood up for myself, and there was no going back. They wanted to live in denial, to sweep everything under the rug, but now the truth was out there. Let them deal with the fallout. I was finally free. In the days following the confrontation, the silence from my family was deafening. For years, they had used guilt and manipulation to control the narrative. But now, with the evidence laid bare, they couldn't spin their usual stories. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this would finally make them see the truth. I was wrong. My mom was the first to reach out. She left me a voicemail the next morning, her voice soft and strained. I think we should talk, she said, as though the events of the dinner hadn't already spoken volumes. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. I know you're upset, but we can't let this tear the family apart. I deleted the message without calling back. I wasn't interested in another lecture about forgiveness or family loyalty. For years, I had been the one expected to forgive, to move on, to be the bigger person. I was done carrying that burden alone. Later that week, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't answer the door, but part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, if only to confirm that she still didn't get it. You didn't have to humiliate them like that, she began, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. I raised an eyebrow. Humiliate them? Mom, they humiliated themselves. All I did was show the truth. Her expression softened into something that almost looked like pity. Honey, you're holding on to so much anger. It's not good for you. I let out a bitter laugh. I'm not holding on to anger. I'm holding on to boundaries. There's a difference. She sighed, clearly frustrated. Matt and Jessica know they messed up. But dragging all of this out isn't going to fix anything. And ignoring it isn't going to fix anything either, I shot back. I'm not going to pretend everything's fine just so everyone else can feel comfortable. If you want to side with them, that's your choice. But I'm not playing along anymore. My dad's reaction was more predictable. He called me a few days after my mom's visit, his tone gruff and impatient. Your mother's worried sick about this whole thing, he said, as though I was the one who had caused the mess. Can't you just let it go? For the kid's sake? For the kid's sake? I repeated, incredulous. Do you even hear yourself? Letting this go is what got us here in the first place. He sighed heavily, like he was the one being inconvenienced. You've made your point, son. Do you really need to keep stirring the pot? I wanted to scream, but I forced myself to stay calm. Dad, this isn't about stirring the pot. It's about accountability. Matt and Jessica have never faced any consequences for what they did, and everyone keeps enabling them. I'm not doing it anymore. He didn't have much to say after that. As for Matt and Jessica, they didn't even bother trying to apologize. I didn't expect groveling, but I thought there might at least be some acknowledgement of what they'd done. Instead, they doubled down, painting themselves as victims in the fallout. Jessica texted me a week after the dinner, a long, rambling message that was equal parts defensive and accusatory. I can't believe you did that in front of the kids, she wrote. Do you even care about how this affects them? Jacob and Lily are so upset. They don't understand why you'd embarrass their mom like that. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. They're upset because you've been lying to them for years. If they deserve anything, it's the truth. She didn't respond. Matt, predictably, stayed silent. Whether it was out of shame or cowardice, I didn't care. The damage was done, and I had no interest in hearing whatever excuses he might have come up with. The hardest part, though, was dealing with my kids. Jacob and Lily were furious with me, their anger fueled by years of half-truths and manipulation from their mom and uncle. Why do you have to do that? Jacob demanded during one of our strained phone calls. Mom said you're just trying to ruin everything because you're mad at her and Matt. I'm not trying to ruin anything, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. I just think you deserve to know the truth. Well, I don't care about your stupid bank statements, he shot back. All you did was make things worse. Lily wasn't much better. When I tried to explain my side, she cut me off with a curt, I don't want to talk about it. It broke my heart. For years, I'd been fighting to stay in their lives, hoping that one day they'd see the full picture. But now it felt like all that effort had been undone. Despite the fallout, I couldn't bring myself to regret what I'd done. For the first time, I had stood up for myself in a way that couldn't be ignored. My parents, my ex-wife, my brother, they could all pretend to be the victims, but they couldn't erase the truth. I knew rebuilding my relationship with Jacob and Lily would take time. They were teenagers, caught in the middle of a messy situation they didn't ask for. But I also knew that protecting them didn't mean letting myself be steamrolled anymore. Over the next few weeks, I focused on moving forward. I leaned on Clara for support, and I started therapy to work through the anger and betrayal I'd been carrying for so long. It wasn't an easy process, but it felt good to finally prioritize my own well-being. Looking back, that confrontation was a turning point. It didn't fix everything. It didn't magically repair my relationships or undo the damage that had been done. But it gave me a sense of clarity and closure that I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I had let other people dictate the terms of my life. That night, I took back some of the control. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, I finally felt ready to walk it on my own terms. It's been 6 months since the night I confronted my family, and I still think about it sometimes. Not with regret, but with clarity. That moment marked the beginning of something new for me, something I didn't even realize I was ready for. I had spent so many years stuck in a cycle of anger, guilt, and trying to prove my worth to people who didn't deserve it. That night, I finally let go. The first step in my fresh start was therapy. It wasn't an easy decision, but Clara pushed me toward it after I called her one night, venting about how lost I felt. She told me, in her blunt, no-nonsense way, "You've been through hell, and you're still carrying it around. If you want to move forward, you need to deal with it." Finding the right therapist took a little time, but once I did, it felt like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying began to lift. In those first few sessions, I learned to unpack the layers of pain and resentment that had built up over the years. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the years of neglecting my own needs, of bending over backward to please people who took me for granted. My therapist helped me see that it was okay to set boundaries, even if it upset people. She reminded me that self-care isn't selfish, it's necessary. Slowly but surely, I started to believe it. Rebuilding my relationship with Jacob and Lily has been harder. Teenagers aren't exactly known for being forgiving, and the years of tension between us didn't disappear overnight. But I'm trying, and so are they. It started small, a few texts here and there, checking in about school or their hobbies. At first, their replies were short and lukewarm, but I didn't let that discourage me. I kept showing up, kept reminding them that I cared, even if they weren't ready to fully trust me yet. One weekend, I took them to a baseball game, a tradition we used to have before the divorce. For the first few innings, the conversation was stiff, mostly about the game. But by the end, Jacob was cracking jokes about my terrible aim when we used to play catch, and Lily was asking if we could do it again sometime. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had something to hope for. Another unexpected blessing has been reconnecting with old friends. After the divorce, I isolated myself. I was embarrassed, ashamed of how much my life had unraveled, and I didn't want anyone to see me like that. But after the confrontation, I realized how lonely I'd let myself become. I reached out to a few old coworkers, friends I'd lost touch with during the chaos. To my surprise, they were thrilled to hear from me. One of them, Kevin, invited me out for drinks with a group of mutual friends. I almost said no. I was out of practice with socializing, but Clara's voice echoed in my head. "You've got to start somewhere." That night turned into one of the best I'd had in years. We laughed until my sides hurt, reminiscing about old times and catching up on each other's lives. It reminded me that there was a world beyond my family drama, a world I was finally ready to step back into. And then there's the dating. I'll be honest, it wasn't something I thought I'd ever do again. After Jessica, the idea of trusting someone felt impossible. But as I started to heal, I realized that not everyone was like her. I met Rachel through a mutual friend at one of Kevin's barbecues. She was funny, warm, and easy to talk to. We bonded over our shared love of bad action movies and the fact that we were both learning to navigate life after messy breakups. We've been seeing each other for a couple of months now, and while it's still early, it feels good, different. For the first time, I'm in a relationship where I don't feel like I'm walking on eggshells or trying to meet impossible expectations. As for my parents, Matt and Jessica, they're not part of my life anymore, and I've made peace with that. My mom still tries to reach out occasionally, leaving voicemails that range from apologetic to passive-aggressive. I haven't responded. My dad hasn't said a word since our last conversation, and honestly, I'm fine with that. Matt and Jessica are, as far as I know, still playing house in the wreckage they created. I don't keep tabs on them anymore. The anger I once felt toward them has dulled to indifference, and that feels like its own kind of victory. The most surprising thing about this fresh start has been realizing just how much life I still have ahead of me. For so long, I thought my story ended the day I found out about the affair. But now, I see it differently. Yes, I lost a lot, but I also gained something invaluable, the chance to rebuild on my terms. To create a life that's not defined by betrayal or guilt, but by hope and resilience. For the first time in years, I'm excited about the future, and that, more than anything, feels like the biggest win of all.